I am also United Methodist clergy, taking a break from pulpit, local congregation, programs and ministry to be the director. And I have had a rich experience across the last 30 years in being part of civil rights storytelling and intersections of various communities across Birmingham around our civil rights history, around human rights history, very involved in the interfaith community of Birmingham, and also with the more newly formed Jefferson County Memorial Project, which is our county's response to the to EJI in Montgomery's, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, and the Memorial Museum to our lynching history, which is of course nationwide. Here in Jefferson County, we have had historical writings more recently from college students charting at least 30 individuals who were lynched. There are actually more than that we're finding along the way. And so I've been a part of that from both the faith community's perspective and then personally wanting those stories to be told. So that is part of who I am and how I am, and I'm really excited to be a part of the BHEC in our own educational programming in the intersections across the community.
Wonderful. And real quick, I just want to mention, if you are unmuted currently, I think we're hearing a little bit.
Sorry, my family is.
Hold on one second. Do you still hear a television in the background, everybody? Okay, cool. All right, so if we could hear from Robby, if you mind, just, I said very briefly who you were, but if you'll introduce yourself.
Absolutely. My name is Robby Ballard, and so I teach 5th and 6th grade American history, which is, I gotta say, my dream job. I absolutely love it. The kids are the perfect age. It's right before they hit 7th grade, and they turn into 7th graders, and it's right after they're in the 4th grade, and they need their hands held a little bit too much for me in the 4th grade. So I love it. And what I'm doing here, where I come in kind of with this, is the Holocaust to me is a phenomenal tool for using what I tell my students. It's the closest approximation to hell that human beings have ever come up with. And what I love about what the BHEC does, when I was first introduced to the BHEC, was that they're taking this and they're doing so much good with it. They're doing so many incredible things with it. Just to speak real quick, just to speak to the level of organization of the BHEC, I called up Ann about 15, 20 minutes ago. I was going over a presentation that I had given related to what I'm going to be talking about today. And I was going over it yesterday and the PowerPoint was working fine. I call her up today because the file's been corrupted. She goes, oh, here, go to this website. We've got it up on the website. We're good to go. Phenomenal institution. And it's that level of organization that drew me to it. So my mother was a civil rights activist in Birmingham, and she was very active within the civil rights movement in Birmingham. She was, according to her, on George Wallace's hit list at one point. Whatever that means. I don't think it was necessarily like, you know, I think it was just his list, so to speak. But her car was firebombed by the Klan. She was harassed, she was followed, she was arrested, she was intimidated. And she kept doing it because she believed so thoroughly in the mission that she was doing. And one of the things that frustrated me so much with the civil rights movement education in Birmingham is that right now, the focus of that education or the emotions that education elicits are shame, their anger, their guilt, depending on which perspective you're looking at the movement from. And I really don't like that, because I think it's a phenomenal tool for productivity and for growth. And so my study kind of goes into how is the Holocaust used to teach growth, to teach progress? How is the Holocaust used how is Holocaust education used to promote positivity and to promote positive change? And then how can we kind of adapt that to the civil rights movement education. As far as the intersection of the civil rights movement and the Holocaust, I'll get to that in a little bit. In my opinion, for whatever it's worth, they have very little intersection aside from the fact that they're human rights struggles. But there's a great deal that we can learn from the very positive ways that the Holocaust has been taught and the positive results of Holocaust education around the world. There's a great deal that we can use from that to better teach the civil rights movement in our own communities. So that's kind of where I come in, I guess, just kind of looking at the intersection between the Holocaust and the civil rights movement.
Amazing.
Does that answer what you're talking about, Leah?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you for that introduction, and we look forward to hearing from you more.
Absolutely.
Why don't we hear just from Joni? What is your role there? Sorry, I just unmuted you, I think.
Yes. So I am the communications, events, and program coordinator. And so I oversee all of our social media as well as helping Anne out with doing some of the educational programs and helping Melissa out. So I'm also very new. I am on my second week. So I'm very excited to be here and to learn more and to interact with you all.
Wonderful. And before I turn it over to Anne, I just want to mention we're joined by George Nathan, who's originally from Birmingham. He's in Atlanta right now, but his parents went through the Holocaust and lived in Birmingham. So I'd love to hear a little bit of your story too after the presentation. But so why don't we go ahead and turn it over to you, Anne? Here, I'm muting you. 1 second. Okay.
I got it. So that we know a little bit about you, is anyone a Holocaust survivor? No. And is anyone a child of a survivor?
Yes.
Okay, just interesting to know who I'm talking to here. So again, my name is Anne Mollengarden. I'm with the Birmingham Holocaust Education Center as their education coordinator. And I have been in this role since the beginning in 2002. My father is a Holocaust survivor from Germany. He got out in 1940. And not that was impetus for what I'm doing at all. It was sort of the other way around. I sort of learned my dad's story because of what I was doing. We have a website that Robby referred to that is very much geared towards being a resource for teachers as well as an information vehicle for the public. We are one of 2 Holocaust institutions in the state of Alabama. There is another one in the very south of Alabama called the Gulf Coast Center for Holocaust and Genocide Education, but they are very much localized to Mobile. And these 2 organizations are funded partially by money from the government that goes through the Alabama Holocaust Commission and is then distributed to us as well. We also get money primarily and through grants as well. So that's kind of how our funding comes about. We do have an annual fundraiser that is our primary vehicle for raising money, and that's usually in August, but we're waiting to see with the current situation what that's going to look like. So who we are an organization that focuses on primarily 2 things, Holocaust memory and Holocaust education. Holocaust memory, meaning not only do we do an annual remembrance program on Yom HaShoah, but throughout the years, there have been over 150 survivors who have made their home in Alabama. Some have stayed, some have left. We are continuing to learn about those, and that is one of our goals, is to understand and know as much about all of these survivors and their stories. And they are all featured on our website. In fact, I've worked with George because he's related to half the people in Anniston, Alabama, and he's been an amazing resource. So that's how George and I connect. And it's these stories that we try to use in our teachings because we feel a certain responsibility that these are, quote, our people, and we want to continue to tell their stories. Up until the last year or so, they have been the primary vehicle for us in reaching out to students. And we have had to make alterations to our curriculum and how we do things with the realization that the survivors will not be here forever. And so we want to continue to tell those stories. So the more we can learn, the more we can continue to tell those through our workshops and through our public programming as well. So the second focus would be education, with a focus on the history of the Holocaust. Because we are a very small organization, we can't do everything. So our primary focus is teaching that history, and then allowing the current present connections to be made either intuitively or more formally, but focusing on education versus going into you know, bullying programs and that kind of thing. If we were a larger institution, that would be more appropriate, but we do tend to focus more on Holocaust education. And it is a topic that is so huge and can offer so many learning experiences that we feel like it's a great vehicle for teachers. I'm going to talk about a few of the things that we can use in teaching with the Holocaust. You know, the Weimar Republic was a democratic republic created after World War I. And the thought is, you know, in our day and age, that a democratic republic is a safe place. Everybody has a voice. Everything's going to end up all right because everybody is participating. But it didn't happen that way in Germany. And it is important for students to understand and examine what events and what failures occurred and why, to help them to better understand our own governments and world governments, and also to make them vigilant in looking out for what's going on in current politics or whatever is going on for the day. So they have to know that democracy is fragile, and we have to pay attention to what is going on. The Holocaust also teaches about the importance of civic participation and social responsibility. The importance of being involved in your community and knowing what is going on and being a part of that. The Holocaust also illustrates the highs and lows of human nature. The Holocaust was primarily about Jews, with them being the primary victims, but there were other victims as well. And there are many parts of this history that are quite revealing about our nature as human beings and what we are capable of. And it's important for people to understand that they wouldn't always be the one to pull the gun or try to attack somebody, that there are so many nuances in who we are as human beings and how we react to exterior situations. And I think that's something that really interests me, is how people react in difficult situations. The students also need to know that history is not inevitable, that we as individuals can make a difference. Whether we are one person or a large community or a group of people, every person can make a difference in some small way. And I think that is one of the lessons they can take home from this. And they also need to understand and wrestle with the concept of what is patriotic loyalty and what is just blind obedience. And when is it appropriate for one and when it is appropriate for the other, and where do you stand on that? So these are the kinds of things that if you are a good Holocaust teacher, and there are many more, that when you're teaching this history, you will tease out these moral conversations. And that's what we try to develop in teachers. So with our teaching, we in the state of Alabama do not have a state mandate. In California, you all do. And we do not, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing, because I would rather have a well-trained teacher who wants to teach this subject than a teacher who's given a curriculum and feels like they have to present it and they don't do it justice or they don't really care. So what we try to do as an institution, primarily as outreach right now, is try to entice teachers to bring more of this curriculum into their classroom. It is in the curriculum, the state curriculum, but not very much, very little as a matter of fact. And so if we can create materials that are readily accessible and are easy to implement in the classroom and are enticing to teachers and they see that they are received well, then hopefully those teachers, whether they are social studies or English language arts, they will pull more of this into their curriculum and add it to their curriculum. And we've been very successful with that, with developing teachers like a Robby, Ballard, and other teachers by the educational programming that we do. We as an organization, because again, we are small, we don't have a research arm and a bunch of PhDs running around, we rely on other national Holocaust organizations for materials and trainings and research. So we work with the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, the Jewish Foundation for the Righteous, the Jewish Partisans Educational Foundation, the ADL, Facing History, and ourselves. All of these organizations we partner with on a regular basis. And they help to provide us some of the background that we need as a small institution. We also have certain programs that are set up on an annual basis, starting with our teacher workshops that we train teachers throughout the state of Alabama. And these workshops, as I said before, sometimes we collaborate with these larger institutions. Lately, we've been developing our own teacher workshops based on stories of Alabama Holocaust survivors. And so these workshops are open to teachers for free. In the past, they've been full-day workshops, and of course they get credits, but the hope is that they will take this information and implement it in their classroom and bring that much more enrichment to their program. We have a scholarship program that allows teachers every summer to attend national workshops at these national institutions so that it's not just our local training, but they can go to the very top for the very best training and bring that back to their classrooms. We also have small study groups called our teacher Cadre, where we meet and discuss very specific topics with teachers who are very interested in learning more on a very detailed basis. We also have speakers that go out to schools. As I said before, these have been survivors. Now we are relying a lot on what we call our guardians of remembrance, which are children of survivors or people that we are training to tell the stories of Alabama survivors. So that is an outreach program that we do. We have a photography and art exhibit that features 20 Alabama survivors. And that exhibit, although it is a permanent art and photography exhibit, we have a traveling version, actually 4 traveling versions that travel throughout the state for free that schools can pick up and have at their schools for as long as they want. That exhibit is also available online. We have a summer fellowship program for graduate students to do research with us called the Ziegler Fellowship. We also have a library and an archive, which are currently in storage. I failed to mention that we have been sort of dislocated from our permanent home, and we are in a temporary home at Temple Emmanuel. But when we find our permanent home again, our library and our archive will be open again to the public. So right now we are working pretty much as an outreach organization. So that's sort of the teacher training component of this. We also work to train the public because the public is not as well trained as they should be either. And to that end, we have a community education series. In fact, if you look on our website, we have one next Thursday on Zoom at 7 o'clock. We have been using for the past 2 years a text called How Is It Possible? It's a series of excerpts from major works of Holocaust scholars that was actually produced by the Jewish Foundation for the Righteous. And we've been reading that over the past 2 years with our adult education class. Another program we have is called Bearing Witness, where we bring in survivors, children of survivors, or other people who want to tell survivor stories to the community. We have one of those on Thursday, May the 14th. We have an annual film series, Holocaust film series. And we also, as I said, have that traveling exhibit and speakers that can also go to community groups, garden clubs, synagogues, churches, and that sort of thing. So we've got a wealth of programming. And then in addition, it seems like every year we have speakers and so forth that come in. We've had exhibits come to town. Really, we run the full gamut. So that's kind of who we are. And does anybody have any questions about any of those programs?
Do I see any questions? Is that Marshall? Are you trying to ask a question? Okay, hold on.
Yeah.
There you go.
Trying to ask a question. She says, do you have a state mandate to teach about slavery and or the civil rights movement?
Yes, we do.
Yeah, you do have a state mandate for that. Oh, good. Okay.
Anything else? And we also work with the Shoah Foundation too. That's in your backyard.
Okay, well, I don't think we have any other questions. I know you and I had a conversation earlier and touched upon some really, interesting experiences in terms of the unique experience for survivors in Birmingham.
Okay.
And so if you wanted to touch upon some of the points we...
Sure. So first of all, I do want to tell you about a paper that was presented 2 years ago when we did a seminar workshop with the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute on the Holocaust and Jim Crow. We are in Birmingham, and Leah asked me, how does the Holocaust play in, how does the civil rights movement play into what you do? Well, I live in Birmingham, so I live and hear about civil rights all the time. So it's sort of our norm. So I guess that's the first thing to understand. But this particular symposium was to address sort of parallels and differences between the Holocaust and Jim Crow. And so there was a student, her name was Hannah Herzog, and she's a graduate student at UNC Chapel Hill. And she did a piece on the intersection of the Southern Jewish experience and the Holocaust. Really looking to see how Holocaust survivors reacted if they were in the South or in Birmingham during the time of the civil rights movement. And I know she interviewed somebody in Atlanta, and George, I can't remember who it was, but he was the only one of all that she interviewed that actually became involved in the civil rights movement. And so you may ask yourself, and I ask myself this, why wouldn't you think after what they had been through that coming to the South, this would have been like a red flag and they would have been activists? But I think what I've come to realize that some people are activists and some people are not. And it takes a certain personality to be an activist. So Leah and I talked about a program that we had done that by accident turned into this discussion. It was a program that we brought in my father, Robert May, who's a survivor, and another survivor whose name is Jack Schnipper, to talk to students who were doing a program at the Civil Rights Institute about the Holocaust. And so they each sort of briefly told their stories, and then the discussion diverted and went into the civil rights and what was it like in Birmingham. So I'm going to share with you some of the things that were really poignant from both of these stories. So my dad came to Birmingham around 1954. He was an obstetrician gynecologist. He set up practice here. And he tells about how he had to open separate waiting rooms because his patients required it. It wasn't that they wanted to have it, but the patients did not want to sit with each other. He said, but the ironic thing is, the women sat outside in their separate waiting rooms, but when they came back to see the doctors, they went into the same examining rooms. And that didn't seem to bother them. And he talks about seeing patients down at the university, UAB, which is a huge medical center, and having to see patients on the basement floor, dirt floor, no private rooms type situation. So these were the African-American patients. He says, but they got the same doctors, the same treatment, they just stuck them in the basement. So he remembers that very vividly. The other thing that really struck him, when I asked him, did he have any regrets about anything that he did or didn't do in his life, not just during the civil rights movement. And one of his greatest regrets was after the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, when the 4 little girls were killed, one of his partners was going to the funeral. And my dad had 3 small children at home. And he said he felt he needed to go, but he could not risk going and something happening to him because he was the sole breadwinner for the family. So there you have a survivor who knew, who comprehended the enormity of this issue and wanting to be involved, but personal safety had to play a major role in his decision making. And when we study the Holocaust and we study rescuers and people who helped during the Holocaust, they come from all walks of life, all personalities. Some are religious, some are not religious, some do it for money, some do it just because they're not really sure why. And once they get started, they can't stop. And so I think it's very hard to know how anyone is going to react in these types of situations. So that's sort of my father's piece of the civil rights movement. The other is Jack Schnipper. So Jack Schnipper's, both of his parents were survivors. He was actually born in a work camp. They came to Birmingham, settled in Birmingham, and opened up a store with the help of the Jewish community. And it was a wholesale type store in downtown Birmingham. And he vividly remembers that his mom used to offer their store for the African-American workers who had no place to go to eat lunch. And it would be raining outside or cold, and they had their sack lunch and they had no place to go to eat. And so she would say, come into the store, sit on a bench and eat. And so she would open up the store for them. He also remembers the day of the Children's Crusade. And he had heard there was a lot of turmoil going on downtown and a lot of noise, and he had a buddy with him hanging out at the store. And as a curious kid, he was probably, he said, 16, 17 years old. He wanted to go see what was going on. So he ran down, which is probably from their store, maybe 8 or 9 blocks, to the what's it called? Outside the Civil Rights Institute, the square is called
Kelly Ingram Park.
Kelly Ingram Park. So Kelly Ingram Park is where the Children's Crusade kind of blew up. The Children's Crusade were students who had taken off of school to march, and they were marching from the 6th Street Church. It wasn't the 16th Street, I think it was the 6th Street Baptist Church down to downtown. And was at Kelly Ingram Park where the police pulled the fire hoses on them and the dogs started attacking the children. And he said he got close, and first he thought it was like a big to-do, you know, this is fun to be around. And then they pulled the fire hoses out and he ran, and he and his buddy ran back to the store. He realized this was not good. So that was interesting because I'd never heard that before. But what came to mind, and what also comes to mind when I think of the EJI memorial that's in Montgomery for all the lynchings in our state, is when you're teaching the Holocaust and you get to the invasion of the Soviet Union and you're talking about the war in the East and what happened and the development of the final solution, the first leg of the final solution was mass killings, and the mass killings with the Einsatzgruppen. And we've studied a lot within our organization about who were these people who did this? What was their motivation? Were they tried and true Nazis? Were they people just like you and I who got recruited in and then just sort of went along with the gang? And what of the people who came to watch? Because if you look at photos of these instances, there are people there watching with their children, with their dogs, very similar to when you see pictures of lynchings, or very similar to the way Jack Schnipper decided to run and see what was going on. And what makes one person stay and look, and what makes another person run away, and what responsibility do we have as human beings to step in or not step in? These kind of issues that you can discuss with your students, although it may not change their reactions, it will at least make them think when they are making their reaction of why they are making that decision. And I'm not saying we can all be the ones to jump in and do something, but at least we will be aware, and maybe we can do something else that is not so dangerous to our personal well-being. So that's the way we can tease some of these stories of Alabama survivors. The other thing I wanted to mention is we have a survivor, or actually 2 survivors in Birmingham, who were professors at Talladega College, which is a historically Black university. And there were many professors in Nazi Germany who, when Hitler first came to power and they were removed from their teaching positions very early on, left Germany and came to the United States and looked for teaching positions. Many of the higher ed institutions would not hire them because they were Jewish. And so many found jobs in historically Black universities. And these 2 teachers actually came to the United States before, they had positions before that and then went to the HBCU. But interesting in their story is they're teaching at this integrated institution and they live in a white neighborhood. And they were condemned by their neighbors for having their Black colleagues come over for dinner. And they had to deal with this sort of reverse discrimination against them. So I think that's a whole angle that we haven't really developed yet. There is a film on that called From Swastika to Jim Crow, which is fascinating, which is a really fascinating film. The other thing that my dad talks about is the anti-Semitism that was in the South. When my dad came to Birmingham, he landed in New Orleans from Germany, lived in New Orleans, never had any problems. He lived in a duplex with a black family next door. They were best friends. And he said there was never an issue of race in New Orleans. Then he came to Birmingham, and it was anti-Jewish, a lot of it, as well as anti-black. As a medical professional and a member of the Jefferson County Medical Society, he could never hold any kind of an office. There were country clubs that were off limits to him. When my mother went to look for a house, she found a house she liked, and then she told the agent that she needed to bring her husband along. So the next visit, she brought my dad, who was very Semitic looking, and the woman said, "Are you Jewish?" And she said, "Yes." And she says, "Well, I'm sorry, I can't show you this house because it's in the charter that it cannot be sold to a Jewish family." So these sorts of things are in the South, and I don't know if they're in California or not. So it wasn't easy for even these survivors that are having to adapt, but many of them, when they came to the United States, they wanted to put everything behind and move forward. And they were willing to do whatever they could to assimilate and to fit in and just kind of sort of bite the bullet and move forward. And that's what many of them did.
Also, do you know the story? I know the conservative synagogue was almost bombed. Like do you know the story behind that?
I don't know what happened. I don't know why that bombed. Melissa, you may know about that.
Only vaguely. Our colleagues, Bob Greenberg, who is the executive director of Temple Bethel, knows that story best. But there were numerous threats of all kinds, but I'm vague on the details.
I do remember him saying that there was even more dynamite placed, I think, on the side of the building than at the Baptist church, but for whatever reason, it just never went off. So,
and the Jewish community had activists in the civil rights movement. I know there was a group of women who were very involved, and the rabbi at the Reform Synagogue, Rabbi Grafman, was very involved, and he is in the famous letter from the Birmingham jail. He was one of the signees on that letter, which was trying to get Martin Luther King to sort of slow down and work through the system to make change. And that was seen as against the movement, which he really wasn't against the movement, but he just felt like it needed to be done in a more orderly than radical process. So it was a very complicated time, for sure.
And what about anti-Semitism today? Or sorry, Melissa, go ahead.
Well, I was going to just offer, previously in my work with what was the National Conference of Christians and Jews, part of the original impetus for that, what was a nationwide organization up until the late 90s, was a rabbi, I think it was Rabbi Newfield, who served prior to Rabbi Grafman at Temple Emmanuel, and a Catholic priest and Protestant clergy whose names I don't recall, but who were this traveling trio, this interfaith trio that drove and spoke all around the state of Alabama in the I want to say in the 30s and 40s. I mean, really early on. And today, because the NCCJ started in 1928, and they were well into their travels. So, you know, ironically, we have this rich history of clergy attempts to promote understanding. And at the time, they would have used the term brotherhood, but the humanity of all people. So. And then what was your question, Leah?
Well, what is anti-Semitism, prevalent today, or what is the experience today?
Well, just recently, one of our supporters shared with me that her 12, 13-year-old nephew who he was born and raised in Israel and recently moved and was part of a community basketball team, Jewish young men, and who would play ball with various non-Jewish young men out of the community center here, and how on social media, and this happened just back in the winter, some of the non-Jewish boys created this hateful anti-Semitic post on Instagram, I think it was, and how her nephew was just shocked and appalled that would happen. Because they otherwise were having fun playing basketball. And so that's one example of how it is still manifest, perhaps not in such a public way, but it's still significant that there's work to do.
No, I mean, that it is there. It is under the surface for the most part, but we get calls from schools at least a couple times a year about instances, and many of the schools are trying to implement tolerance, not just Jewish, but all kinds of group tolerance in their school system. So the good news is that they are being proactive and they are facing it and they are talking about it versus just letting it simmer. But my kids grew up here and they had anti-Semitic incidences against them as well. Certainly not in the legal realm or within restrictions. All of those restrictions for the most part are gone, but personal anti-Semitism, yes, it is definitely out there.
Gotcha.
If I could speak to that a little bit as well, what I see with young people, I see anti-Semitism that they don't really recognize as anti-Semitism. They don't perceive the nature of it. And I mean, I've had instances. Fortunately, I teach at an independent school, and it has a selective admissions process, and so fortunately, we're able to the admissions process is based on academic ability, and so fortunately, with higher academic ability, with higher intelligence, usually comes greater tolerance as well, because of course intolerance is based on ignorance. So fortunately, we don't have too much to deal with it at the school where I teach. I've had incidents where we'll be discussing the Holocaust in class, and I'll have a student say, raise his hand and say, well, my dad said that the majority of people killed weren't actually Jews, that most people who were killed were Christian, which my response is, 11 million people killed, 6 million of them Jews. Let's do some math real quick, all right? Correct me if I'm wrong, but the math points to what the math is. And so I think the anti-Semitism that I see in young people, which I think is a reflection of their parents, is under the surface. As Anne was saying, it's not outright, it's not legally instituted, it's not anything of that sort, what Anne was discussing that her father encountered when he moved to Birmingham, but it's simmering under the surface in a way that I would say, I'm not particularly well versed on it, but in a way that I would say is similar to many other parts of the country. In Birmingham, however, I think there's slightly more willingness for people to discuss it and what they might think is a safe environment for discussing that. Would that be, Anne, would you agree with that?
Yeah.
So sorry. I just want to add on to kind of with what Robby, Melissa, and Anne are saying. Previously to coming here, I worked within the schools doing social justice trainings, and a lot what I saw from the students is there's just a lack of diversity in meeting people. So a lot of our schools in downtown Birmingham are predominantly Black and brown, and they've never met a Jewish person. and they've never interacted with a Jewish person. And so somewhat like Robby was saying, it was just a lack of awareness that that there's someone other than me. And then as well too, I think here in the South, Protestant Christianity is very dominant, and it plays a role in schools as well. In public schools, you know, they have Christian Bible studies that meet every week. And just in that, the conversation even to talking with people who do not identify as that, students who don't identify in that religion, it can be very isolating. And so just like Robby and Ann and Melissa said, it's not outright, but just even in how the schools function and what they do, you can see that it's just a push towards Protestant Christianity, and it can be very anti-Semitic in ways.
And Robby, you and I talked earlier on the phone about your experience in the classroom, and what you've been doing. Do you mind expanding on that?
Sure, absolutely. So I shared a PowerPoint a little bit prematurely in the chat window. I apologize about that. I thought I was just uploading it, and then I was going to send when I was talking about it, but it went ahead and sent. So anyway, what I do in the classroom, in the school that I teach at, again, it has a selective admissions process. Fortunately, it has a very robust financial aid program. So we have a highly socioeconomically diverse student body, but we do have some students who are whose names you will see all over town, who have been very prominent and whose families were very prominent in Birmingham's industrial past. And so when we start talking about convict leased labor in Birmingham, which we spend a good bit of time talking about, we start talking about the companies. So for instance, one of them, the Sloss family, well, this year I have a child whose last name happens to be Sloss. So, and that's not the first instance of that. And so one of the things that I'm most focused on with my education is how do we address the sins of our fathers, so to speak, in a productive way. And Holocaust education, as I was saying earlier, for the most part, has done a phenomenal job of that, where the intent of that has been to, where the intent of that has been deliberate. And so one of the questions that I get very frequently, because I've got a good body of research on both the Holocaust as well as the Civil Rights Movement, one of the questions that I get pretty frequently is, where do the two intersect? How are the Holocaust and the Civil Rights Movement, how are they the same? And if it's all right with you, I'd like to share my screen real quick. Is that okay, Leah?
Great. Here, I'll make you a co-host.
Okay. And so, yeah, I just want to go over real quick where those intersections are and why there are so few of them. So what we're looking at here, how they're separate. For me, it goes down to the purpose. With the Jim Crow South, the purpose of that was subjugation. With Holocaust Germany, the purpose was extermination. Therefore, the two are inextricably divided. When you look at the purpose of the two, every step along the path towards that end goal, which in the South was subjugation and which in Holocaust Germany was extermination, or excuse me, which in Nazi Germany was extermination, every step along there is diverging down a different path because they're headed towards different goals. The reason African Americans were undeserving of freedom, reason for the Holocaust, Jews were undeserving of life. The upper limit with Jim Crow South, legally sanctioned and implicitly condoned lynching, the upper limit in Holocaust Germany, again, the closest approximation to hell that human beings have ever come up with, the genocide that was carried out. The societal remnants in the Jim Crow South, legal prohibitions of African American freedoms have been left largely intact. And in Germany, anti-Semitic laws were overwhelmingly stricken. That doesn't mean anti-Semitism doesn't exist anymore, of course. You know, one of the things that I tell my students all the time, haters gonna hate. There are always gonna be people who are going to hate. There's still anti-Semitism, but as far as legally sanctioned, that's been stricken from the books, you know, of course, by force most of the time. How are they equal? The genesis of Jim Crow South, longstanding racism towards Blacks and African Americans throughout the South, and to a lesser but still present degree in the North, the genesis of the Holocaust, longstanding anti-Semitism. The lower limit of Jim Crow and the Holocaust mandated social ostracization, the motivation, demonization of the other for political gain, economic extraction, and at its core, they were human rights struggles. So the similarities between them are very different. The similarities between them are, in my opinion, far and few between because the goals were so different. So what I do with the way that I approach both the Holocaust as well as the civil rights movement in my classroom is I want to have an end goal. I was very fortunate to receive a research grant to go to Germany a few years ago and to conduct a bunch of interviews, to talk with a bunch of people about how the Holocaust is taught in Germany today. Because that's always been a very fascinating question to me. How do you teach the Holocaust in Germany when you're looking at these pictures and these guards were the grandfathers of the students? How do you approach that? And in Birmingham, it's relatively similar to the conundrum that I face with my students whose parents employed convict leased labor to a very large degree, and to a lesser known extent, but I would still say a very present extent, their ancestors owned slaves. I know for instance, my ancestors, my uncle is a historian as well, and he dug in the family's past and found that I have a several greats removed uncle, Josiah Davenport, who owned a slave ship. And so with young people, they can start taking those kinds of things very, very personally, start thinking somebody in my family did this, and they can start feeling a lot of guilt. They can start feeling a lot of shame. And so I want to mitigate that as much as possible for my students and use these lessons to elicit productive emotions. How can we be a more productive society? So I was fortunate to go to Germany and do this research. I spoke with officials in the Bavarian Department of Education. I spoke with museum directors. I spoke with teachers. I spoke with parents. I spoke with students. I spoke with pretty much anybody who would talk to me, and you would be amazed either how good the conversation starter or how bad the conversation starter. Tell me about what you learned about the Holocaust. How it has varying effects on people, but I gleaned a great deal of information, and the one thing that I got that was almost in unison, I asked everybody that I spoke with, I asked them a question. In 1985, West German President Weizsäcker is giving a speech on May 8th. The rest of the world is commemorating the end of hostilities in Europe in World War II. And he's giving a speech to West Germany in Berlin, and he says, right now the rest of the world is partying like there's no tomorrow. Right now the rest of the world is celebrating the fact that we got a shellacking unlike any other shellacking in human history, and that we deserved it. We deserved it times 1,000. So what do we in Germany, what do we do today with that information? And he gives this incredible speech. I highly recommend looking it up. It's absolutely phenomenal. And one of the questions that he says, or one of the points that he makes is, the youth of Germany today are not responsible for what happened over 40 years ago, but they are responsible for what they do with it. And so that was the guiding question that I had with everybody that I spoke with in Germany. What do you want young people to do with this? What is the goal? What do you want them to see? What outcome do you want to elicit from your Holocaust education? And to a person, every single one of the dozens of people I spoke with said, we want them to gain a greater appreciation for their role in democracy. And I thought that was so fascinating that they had gone back to what they saw as the genesis of the Holocaust, which was the breakdown in democratic institutions in Weimar Germany. And that was the entire goal of their education for the Holocaust, was to build an appreciation for democracy and to show what happens when democratic institutions collapse. To show, not necessarily what happens, but what can happen when democratic institutions collapse. And so I take that back to the classroom. And the goal when we're talking about the civil rights movement is, how did this start? where did this start? And we got to go all the way back to 1600, and we got to build it up from there. But with the end goal in mind of building within my students a respect for democratic institutions, a respect for their role, and also a respect for the fragility of democratic institutions, that they are not a given. We live in this world, and especially in the United States, where we take our democratic institutions entirely for granted. And that's endemic throughout the country. And so I want them to know that they are required participants and that they must be informed participants, and that the potential outcomes are horrific. That the potential outcomes are, again, the closest approximation to hell that human beings have ever concocted. So the presentation that I just shared is one that I gave at the BHEC, golly, probably a year or two ago, and something like that. And the title of it is Get Over It, because that's something that we hear a great deal in Birmingham with regards to the civil rights movement. Get over it. Be done with it. Can we stop beating this dead horse? Can we just move on? And that's another sentiment that I gained from a lot of people in Germany, is that they were very concerned that the youth of Germany were tired of the Holocaust, that their mentality was, get over it, it's done, let's move on, you know? And so many of the people that I spoke with were in the early stages of grasping, how do we maintain the relevance of this without, you know, logging a dead horse? And that's similar to what we're approaching in Birmingham, or how we're hopefully going to be approaching the civil rights movement in Birmingham, is how do we approach this in a way where we're not flogging a dead horse, where the response isn't get over it, where the response is, yeah, that's valid, that's necessary, we need to know that. And so in keeping with this mentality, or this approach to Holocaust education in Germany, I wanted to look at, why do people feel this sentiment of get over it with regards to the civil rights movement? And what I can find is that it's based on the emotions that it elicits, which goes back in a circular way to what I was first saying. The emotions that civil rights education in Birmingham currently elicits are shame or guilt or anger, depending upon which perspective you are looking at the civil rights movement from. And I found that through educational materials that are produced by institutions relevant to the civil rights movement in Birmingham. I found that in literature produced by educational institutions in Birmingham. I found that in just about everything that I've looked at with regards to civil rights education in the city of Birmingham, that the focus of it is shame, guilt, and anger. And those are very counterproductive emotions as far as building an appreciation for the subject. And so that's where I think in great deal the BHEC does a phenomenal job, is that they are not trying to elicit any of those emotions. They are not trying to elicit any of those negative attitudes. They're simply looking at the study of the Holocaust and saying, how can we build a better, more free, more democratic society, and do that through education of young people. And that's what I would like to see happen with the civil rights movement in Birmingham. Unfortunately, there's resistance to that. There's resistance to the idea. I've encountered a great deal of resistance towards an approach to the civil rights movement from that angle, as trying to, you know, quote, whitewash the history, which my response to is, nobody's trying to whitewash anything. We're simply trying to get something. We're simply trying to promote progress, promote change, positive change, by using this story for a productive way, rather than just telling the story and eliciting emotions. Let's use it. We've got this. If we can look at it the right way, this gift of our past, that we can create a better, more beautiful future for our city. If we use the lessons of our past in a more appropriate and in a more productive way, we can create a more beautiful future for our city, the same way countries such as Germany have done with their approach to Holocaust education. An example that I refer to with my students, the Syrian, Iraqi, and Afghan refugee crisis that was occurring in Germany, that was occurring in the Middle and Near East a few years ago, which is still occurring, but Germany's approach to it that they adopted a few years ago, Germany accepted several 100,000 refugees from those countries, compared to France, which at the time that I was there, I haven't looked at updated numbers, had admitted only about 40,000 refugees. And when I was speaking with somebody in the Bavarian Department of Education and asking him about that, he said, well, you know, in the past, we've been on the other end. We've been the country that people were desperate to get out of and nobody would take them. And we've seen what happened as a result of that. So today we're going to be the country where when people are desperate to get out of somewhere, they come to us and we'll let them in. And that's, I mean, that's beautiful. That's incredible. And that is using their history. That is using their negative past to create a better, more prosperous, more welcoming future for all of their citizens and for the world as a whole. And I think the more we can do things like that, the better off our society will be.
Amazing. So I actually have a question for you, Robby, and you could also answer to this too. In teaching Holocaust to 5th and 6th graders, how detailed or specific or gruesome do you get? I'm a docent at a Holocaust museum in LA, and we often skip the display on concentration death camps for kids that young.
So I think that's a question I get a lot, and that was one of the. It was amazing how many questions the people I was interviewing in Germany had for me. One of them was, how do you address the American genocide? Which, when I was first asked that, I had to stop and pause. And she said, you know, with the Native Americans. And I thought, we don't address it as a genocide, you know, which is a major issue. It's a major problem. But the other question I got is, as teaching 5th and 6th graders, because most of the teachers I spoke with over there were high school teachers, how do I approach it? And to your point, how detailed? And I would say with my students, I get pretty detailed. I'm very fortunate, however, again, in that I teach at an independent school where I don't have state mandates. In my 6th grade history class, which is where we discuss the Holocaust, I usually, this year, you know, not the case, unfortunately, but usually we end up spending anywhere from a month and a half to 2 months discussing the Holocaust, from the Treaty of Versailles to 1985, the speech that I give, which is then when I impart upon them, what are you going to do with this? What are you going to do with what you have just learned over the past months about the Holocaust? What are you going to do with that? And don't tell me be nice to people. Don't tell me you're going to help people, because all of that is garbage. You don't get a cookie for doing what you're supposed to do, and you should be doing that anyway. What are you going to do with it to make your life better and to make this city better? And so we get pretty detailed in it in such a long discussion, but I've never encountered a student who was, and I've been doing this, I've been teaching for about 13 years. I've been teaching the Holocaust for about 8 years now. I have never encountered a student who has felt uncomfortable with the subject matter. I've never encountered a parent who has felt uncomfortable with the subject matter. My department chair has come in, I've asked him to come in, sit in on the class, tell me. I've had the guidance counselor from the school come in and sit in on the class, some of the classes where we get into more detailed discussions. And in observing the students, they say they think the students are handling it very well. And I think it's because I am allowed to go into so much detail. What breeds fear is ignorance. And so when I have the time to build their understanding of why this is happening, they're not as afraid, they're not as scared, they're not as shocked. They start making these connections on their own, and they start seeing, yeah, this was the next step. Of course, this is what the Nazis were going to do next. Of course, this is what this is going to look like. This was the next step. When I have the time as a teacher, and again, I'm very, very fortunate to have that kind of time and to have that kind of support from my school, where they say, you want to spend 2 months talking about the Holocaust? Homie, get it, go do it, you know? And so because I'm able to go into that level of detail, I find that they can handle a great deal. The one thing that we do not do, I don't show photographs of naked victims, and that I'm not really sure why, but it's just kind of, I think that's more for me. I'm just going to hold on to that one thing that we're not going to do. they have seen pictures of gas chambers. They have seen pictures of train cars. The famous photograph of the train car at Dachau when the American GIs showed up and there were bodies falling out of it. They've seen that, and we discuss that and we talk about that. And I think that's another benefit to my discussion of the Holocaust with my students, is that when we're looking at one of those pictures, I don't have to say we have to move on. I have the time to answer every single one of the questions that they have. And when they have that understanding, they lack that fear.
I want to add to what Robby said, because I too used to teach 6th grade at the Jewish day school here. And I think when you have students this young, absolutely you need to watch which images you use. And you can teach this subject without any dead bodies. And in fact, I tell teachers, you can teach this subject without ever even digging into what happened at Auschwitz. That the important things of this subject are, how did this regime come to power? How did they usurp power? How did they enlist the common man to go along with this? And what was their progression of thought in getting there? You can talk about the camps, you can show them diagrams of the camps, you can talk about the gas chambers and the ovens without ever showing a picture. And in that way, they get the true history. You're not trying to hide anything from them. And if they ask a question, answer it. They just don't have to see those visual images that might give them nightmares. But
I would also like to add that as far as the photographs that I was talking about, to what Anna's saying, in our 2-month discussion of the Holocaust, we probably spend a day or two at the very most discussing the more horrific details of the camps. And on top of that, this is something that I make sure to do every single year, is the kids ask questions about it, and in a respectful way, and they want to know what that looked like. They want to know what they want to be able to visualize this. And they're asking that not in a gory, not in a like seedy way, because especially by that point, I've hopefully developed in them a profound respect for what we're talking about. And they want to know. They want to know, they want to understand, and they want to be able to put an image to that. And so in our 2 months though, in our month and a half, 2 months of discussing the Holocaust, that maybe comprises 1 or 2 class periods.
Great. I do want to, for the sake of time, I want to hear a little bit from George, and then I want to open it up for questions. I see, Paul, you have a question. We'll get to you next, but if we could hear from George, that would be great. Hold on, I'm unmuting you. George, can you help me?
Okay,
oh, there we go.
Got it. All right. Ann and I met about 1.5 years ago, and it was because I started looking at the Birmingham Holocaust Center website and saw a lot of family information. Didn't think it was all correct, so we met for the better part of a day, and that and some correspondence, and got a lot of that fixed. But she's right. Was is probably right, related to about half the families in Anniston. There were about 30 or 35 families if you go back to the 50s and 60s, and about half were relatives. Most of, can I say most? I can say all the relatives came from Germany, and I'll use my family as an example. My father's family came over before the war primarily. My mother's family came over after the war. And I'm going to say my mother, in the group in Anniston, my mother was the only Holocaust survivor who had been through the camps. The rest had escaped mostly in the 30s. My grandfather, my paternal grandmother's older brother had come over around 1910 or 1911, had become a successful businessman, And he was the key, he was the sponsor who helped my paternal grandfather and his family get out. Both grandfathers were from the same town. They were World War I veterans, had fought for Germany, earned Iron Crosses, and the paternal grandfather saw what was coming, was very well known around town, but he said it's time to go, and he did. And my maternal grandfather took the approach that this is my home, it's been the family home for generations, these are my friends, they won't hurt me. And the short version of that is it cost him his life. So they were well, I think Ann knows I could talk for hours, but I'm not going to do that. In Anniston now, if you look at the profile of the Jewish community, it's dying out, literally and figuratively. The temple is down to a core of probably 40 or 50 members, most not terribly active. From my generation, almost everyone has left. Anniston simply wasn't a place that you could earn a living unless you were in the, let's call it the traditional retail establishment type professions. So, I mean, that's an exceptionally quick overview. We moved to Birmingham in 1959 because my father bought a business, and that's where I grew up, went to high school, left to go to college in Atlanta, and effectively never came back to Birmingham. Still have friends there that we see, and we go to life cycle events, but really have not spent a lot of time in Birmingham as an adult. I'd made notes on a couple, well, Ann was talking about, and Robby, about anti-Semitism under the surface. And I can tell you, growing up, that I was lucky. I was never called a dirty Jew or anything like that. But everybody knew I was Jewish. Not because I advertised it or had a sign or a label or anything else, but they knew. And once in a while, somebody would say something like, "Oh, well, you're Jewish. That's, that's different." And we had never discussed it. They had never asked, but they just knew. To the point about people going out to watch a lynching or going out to watch the Nazis execute, whether it was Jews or gypsies or whomever it might have been, the mass shootings. As you moved farther east, and this is my opinion, people may debate it, but as you move farther east, in Poland, and my mother was in Latvia, there was a very strong undercurrent of anti-Semitism. And once Hitler was in power, all of a sudden it was okay. So when you see pictures of people standing in the background while the Nazi soldiers are shooting Jews and having them fall into mass graves, why? Because all of a sudden it was okay. It was okay to be anti-Jewish. It was okay to get rid of this population segment that they didn't want around. It allowed that latent anti-Semitism to bubble to the surface. So, I mean, like I say, that's my opinion. And I think the lynchings in that respect were very similar. And you have to unmute.
Hold on.
There we go. I was just going to say, with what you had to say, and especially, like what went on in Estonia and Latvia, and what Robby said, that the biggest danger in the Holocaust world of study that people are talking about is the danger of painting with a broad brush. And I'm sure it's the same for civil rights. That the Holocaust will become the death of 6 million Jews. It will be the pictures of the dead bodies and the opening gates to Birkenau. And that will be the study of the Holocaust. And the danger is the nuance that you lose when you do not study this subject in depth. Those things I talked about at the very beginning, the nature of the human beings, why people make the decisions that they make, what we're capable of doing. Those kinds of things are not something that can easily be learned in a textbook, without some kind of an in-depth study. And if we don't continue to support in-depth study and in-depth teaching, we are going to risk this subject being just like, the Civil War or, the fall of the Roman Empire. And there's so much to be learned from it. And that's the greatest fear in the Holocaust world.
Okay, so I want to go ahead. We only have 12 more minutes. Open it up for questions. So Paul, let me go ahead and call on you.
Yeah, hi. Sorry, excuse my voice. I've got a little cold, something going on here. But this educational approach that you guys are talking about fits right in with an experience I had last November. My wife works at Kilat Marah, which is a Santa Monica synagogue in Santa Monica. And we went to Eastern Europe last November, Poland, the Czech Republic, and Berlin. And I had an opportunity to visit 4 of the concentration camps: Treblinka, Auschwitz, Birkenau, Auschwitz II, and Theresienstadt. And as I came there and I stood in the middle of this, I finally realized that I had a need to take the study or the understanding of the Holocaust beyond the cerebral level, which is how we teach this. And because that's the way we teach. It's an appropriate way. I'm not saying that we're doing this thing incorrectly, but I think there's a chance to take this a lot further. And I think with the adult population, there's a real opportunity here. Standing there and it brought back a lot of experiences with my mom, who grew up in Germany, and her father got her out of there in 1933. I think this would not be. I think visiting these places is a tremendous opportunity for adults, Jewish and otherwise, to really take the study and understanding of the Holocaust to a much more guttural level, which I think is definitely lacking because just because of the inability to go beyond looking at pictures, reading about it, looking at documents, which is all, we have to continue to do that. Please don't misunderstand me. But there's a chance here for adults, Jews and otherwise. When I stood in the middle of Auschwitz, there were hundreds and thousands of people there that day, and a lot of them were not Jewish. I think you guys in Alabama are doing a great job here. But I want you to kind of maybe consider, I don't know if you are considering taking some funds and trying to create opportunities for the Jews and non-Jews in Alabama,
Yes.
Not kids. I agree that taking kids to this place does not serve a useful purpose at that time.
We actually, Paul, I was going to say our board had and still hopes to host a group to Eastern Europe, to Auschwitz next fall, so fall of 2021. And it's a board of directors that's very diverse racially and faith identity and all of that. And so the hope would be that we would host it and others would join us. And it would be, for now, a trip for adults. One of my passions, like Joni's and Robby's, are students, and especially in terms of young adults, upper high school, college age students. So in the future, my hope is that we will also sponsor a journey such as that, and maybe even try to combine it with a trip to South Africa and to Eastern Europe. So
if I could speak to that and show some uncharacteristic brevity of speech, in two things that I would say. Number one, I wholeheartely agree with you, Paul, that there is no comparison to visiting these sites. There is absolutely no comparison. When I show photographs that I took at Dachau, it doesn't matter what other photographs my students have seen. As soon as they see the picture that Mr. Ballard took, that carries so much more gravity and so much more weight. And I would also say that the BHEC does an incredible job of bringing survivors to schools, which for our students, I think is probably going to be the closest they ever come to firsthand seeing the Holocaust, is being able to meet these survivors. When Anne's father, Dr. May, makes his annual visit to come talk to my 6th grade, I've had students, I had one student who shook his hand as he was leaving the room, and the student told me later that he had to go into the bathroom because he started crying, because he told me, I've never touched anything so powerful in my entire life. And that's, I'm welling up right now. The BHEC does an incredible job.
Yeah, there was another incident also. The Polish government is working hard to distance themselves from the responsibility that they had during this Holocaust period. We even had one of the guards that's responsible just for the security of the camp, I mean, just generally speaking, came over to us and tried to make sure that our guide, who was an Israeli, was teaching us the appropriate comments about what went on here. And our rabbi got into a big discussion with the guide at another location about some accuracy with what was going on with the Poles and the Germans. So that's just an aside, another issue.
Okay, so why don't we hear from Rebecca? She's been patiently waiting. Go ahead.
Hi, it's actually Leonard.
Leonard, there you go.
Leonard here. Just as an aside, I had a cousin who actually taught at the medical school there in Birmingham back in the 60s. But my question is, I remember reading about a guy named Bloomberg who lived in a town called Dothan, somewhere in Alabama, and he was actually paying Jewish people, Jewish families, $50,000 a piece to move to town to try to keep the Jewish community in his town alive. And I just wanted to know if you guys are familiar with that and what happened to that project.
I am familiar with that because we've done workshops in Dothan, and I haven't been to Dothan in a while. They lost their rabbi, and I don't know if they got another one. It was a lovely woman, I can't remember her name. And they brought several families in, and some stayed and some didn't. I don't know if that offer is still on the table or not, but it's a wonderful community. Yeah, it was, much like Anniston, they had this flight from the small towns, and they wanted to revitalize their Jewish community. And there were people who, were looking for a friendly place to live, and they thought this was a great thing. Yeah.
So the next question is, who founded the BHEC, and was the original purpose to relate the Holocaust to the Civil Rights Movement, or was that added later?
And I started answering that in the text chat, and Anne can speak more to this, but Phyllis Weinstein was our founder, and remains a close friend of Anne's, and I happened to get to know her when I was in my 20s with the NCCJ, and she wanted to make sure that our survivor stories lived and taught for future generations. She was very much involved with the Alabama Holocaust Commission, which mostly still is a connector for those of us who are in this work, but also we have an annual Yom HaShoah commemoration, which didn't happen last week, but did happen online with us yesterday. And so that was a large part of the impetus. And my understanding is that it did not have a connection to our civil rights history, other than, as Anne said earlier, we are here in Birmingham, Alabama. And so there's going to be that layer of shared history.
So we have time for one more question, if there is one more question.
Leah, if I can,
Okay.
I want to add a comment if there's not a question.
Who is it? Sorry.
This is George.
Oh, George, go ahead. And then Marshall will ask the last question.
Okay, real quick. Robby, I also have been back to Germany a number of times, both to the old hometown and to the site, a couple of sites where my mother and her family were, I'll just say, incarcerated, because it wasn't the actual ghetto or camp where they spent most of their time. And the most common thing I ran into was, we don't understand how this happened. And that was from both my generation, who would have grown up with parents who would have been Nazi soldiers. And it was particularly evident with our, what I'll say are my children, people who were the age of my children. One guy who was the grandson of the commandant of one of the prisons that they were held in, wrote an article in German called My Grandfather the Nazi. And it was his way of trying to, I'll say, unburden a bit. But the biggest question is, we don't understand how this happened. We can't rationalize it. And with that, I'll stop and let the last question go.
All right.
Hi.
So, Hannah, take us home.
Yes, both of my parents were Holocaust survivors, and it was major discussion in my family. And my kids went to Jewish day schools, and I remember my youngest daughter who went to a Jewish day school saying, "Why are we always victims?" She never learned in school about well-known Jewish figures in Polish history and German history and history altogether, but she did learn a lot about the Holocaust. So I wonder, is there a danger, especially to Jewish students, to think of themselves as victims if you always concentrate so much on the suffering? I mean, I think it's important to learn about the Holocaust, extremely important, but I think it's also important to learn about what the Jewish communities were like in these cities when they were vibrant.
So,
What do you think of that, especially for the teacher who teaches the 5th and 6th graders? I'd like to address that to him.
I think we spend a good bit of time in my class discussing pre-war life for Jews, because I want my students to understand more than anything else that that Jews in Germany were assimilated, that they were in enclaves, if you will, that there were all different types of Jewish experiences in Germany, but I want them to understand that these were normal people who were living normal lives, doing normal things the same way that my students are living normal lives, doing normal things, and are most of the time normal people. Some of them are real abnormal, but that's just 6th grade, I guess. But I want them to see this. And another thing that we spend a great bit of time discussing is not just the survivors, but the thrivers, the Jewish communities that were able to thrive throughout this, and how they carried their traditions with them wherever they went, how they carried on Jewish traditions in the most horrific of circumstances, when their lives were threatened as a result, or their lives were threatened for carrying on these traditions, that they did that they showed themselves not just as victims, but as heroes, as people who were carrying on this history, this tradition. As one, I forget either what movie or what book it was from, but there was a survivor who was saying Jewish people have a very long memory. They have a very long memory, and we carry our traditions with us. And I forget what book that was, but it was a survivor who was talking about why he was willing to risk his life to light a menorah when he was in a concentration camp. And he was saying, because I have a long memory, because I have to carry these traditions on. And that's the kind of tough as nails mentality that I want my students to see. I don't want them to see sheep being led to a slaughter, because that wasn't what it was. That would be a lie. I want them to see people who, honest to God, were tough as nails, who were up against a behemoth of hellacious fury. And they did, when they asked the question, why didn't they just leave? I tell, homie, they tried to. And a lot of the time they did. Let's look at what was up against them. And then we go through the immigration documents that it took to get into the United States. You know, I want them to see that these people were tough as nails. They were just up against a behemoth, you know?
Well, I would like to add to that, just briefly to address you. When they teach the Holocaust in Israel, their first unit is resistance, because they want Israeli kids to know the importance of resistance. When we teach in the United States, we start with, like what we discussed, about pre-war Jewish life and what Jewish life was like. And unfortunately for many teachers with limited time to teach this subject, you don't get time to get through everything even, or you have no time to do resistance. But we have a lot of materials on resistance. We work with the Jewish Partisan Educational Foundation, which teaches about resistance. And the resistance came informed in many different forms, from fellow Jews, from Christians, from governments to organizations. And a lot of times it's just a matter of a teacher not having the time to address that, unless they incorporate it, like Robby said, within what they're already doing and point out the resistance. And resistance for students today often looks like a gun. But resistance during the Holocaust, because that was not even an option, took different forms that students today have to be taught. This was resistance. This was resistance to teach your kids in the ghetto. This was resistance to stay alive in a camp. This was resistance to go and try to find food. And so resistance didn't look like what we think of as resistance today.
Just to add one more thing to what Ann said, one of the discussions that my students always find the most fascinating is talking about Jewish resistance and talking about the multiple forms that it took on, just as Ann is saying, that resistance was resistance. I forget, I don't have my notes in front of me. I forget which survivor it was who said it, but the greatest act of resistance he could perform against the Nazis was living. And I want them to be able to see that
resistance takes all different kinds of forms, that it's blowing up railroads and that it's carrying on their Jewish traditions. When they walk out of my classroom, hopefully they do not see Jews as victims. They see them as people who were tough as leather, who made it through and survived, and the Jewish traditions survived, at least, through, again, the closest approximation to hell human beings have ever come up with.
Well, thank you so much. Please, let's everybody just thank our speakers for taking the time to do this. This was an exceptional presentation. The work that you're doing at the center is just extraordinary, and it's just so interesting to hear, you know, the unique experience being in Birmingham, the way you approach everything. And so I sent the link for the website if you want to check it out further. But thank you so much. And tomorrow we're heading to Montgomery, and we'll be speaking with Rabbi Scott Kramer, who's the head of the Conservative Synagogue, which is actually both Ashkenazi and Sephardic. The Sephardic community is from Rhodes. So we'll hear from him, and then also Adiela Bennett, who was a woman that I met on the steps of the Dexter King Church, where she is a member. One of the most dynamic, lovely, wonderful people. She's become a friend of mine. She also heads this organization, Women in Training, founded by her and her two twin daughters, where they combat period poverty, because that's a big issue over there. And they're doing amazing work, and they're in the news all the time. Like they're absolute change makers over there. So yeah, tomorrow we will be speaking with the two of them at 3 p.m. So with that said, again, thank you to all the presenters, and we hope to connect with you when we're in Birmingham. So
thank you.
Everybody have a great rest of your afternoon, and hopefully I'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you so much.